Hi again. Here we are to continue with our weather API project, and so far we've got some code here that's getting the weather, but it's getting the temperature in Kelvin, and that's maybe not that great for us, right? Like nobody's going to understand that, or very few people are going to understand how hot that is, right, or how cold, right? Um, so how can we improve on that? Well, the Open Weather Map API gives us a an option for this, right? So I'm going to go to their documentation, and I'll go to the API here. And if I go, we're using this current weather data, so I'll go to that one. And when I scroll down here, let me actually go find units. Yeah, so they don't say it here, but they show at the end of this line, you can kind of, if you can read that, it says units metric, right? So if you, let me go down a little bit further here. Yeah, units format. So if I look this up in their docs, it says, oh, standard, metric, and imperial units are available. And then they give us some example API calls. So you can say standard, find query London and units metric, or and units imperial, right? So we can include that. So we'd like our API to be able to support that feature, right? Because we're kind of wrapping our library is wrapping their API. It's kind of, making a pathway to their API like easier to use. And we should expose this feature, right? So it'd be nice if you could pass in the zip code, the API key, and the unit, right? So let's try that. So what if we imagine get weather, and it's got zip and API key, and you want to include units on the end here. And if I switch over to the weather API JS, now get weather needs to have a third parameter here, units, right? And then our path needs to be built to support units, right? So so far we've got zip and API key, and then now on the end here we'll have to also include ampersand units equals, and then we'll do $ curly braces, and we'll get the units that were passed in. And maybe we can also give units up here a default. So I'm going to say default imperial, right? So this will be the default value, and if you don't include it, it'll have this, right? And so that'll work pretty good. Let's try it out, right? It's a little hard to read here, but because my line of code is getting a little too long there, but anyway, there we go, right? So we got units imperial, and we're going to get the units over here, and I'll just leave it off, and it should be the default value, or we could say const units equals, let's do a metric, right? So if I leave it off, I should get imperial, and if I include it with a value of metric, it should give me Celsius, right? So let's give that a try. So right now I did not include units, so it should be in imperial units. So let's do 94122, and I'll search 48 degrees. That sounds about right. Let's see, what if I go over here and I say include metric as a unit, right? So I did it this way. We could have just put the string here, but I figure we might want to have some input from our form, potentially like a drop-down menu or something that lets you pick that, and then we'd probably get it from a variable. So it'll be easier for us to do it this way, and then plug a value in here that was dynamic, right? So let's try it now. So we've got metric units in there, and I'll refresh, and we'll get the zip code, the same one, 94122 again. Oh, 8.89. Maybe that's right. Yeah, I think that's pretty close. So anyway, so there we go. Now we've got our units working. Now this is getting kind of long, like we're starting to have like a lot of parameters in here, right? And besides taking the zip code, get weather, or the open weather map also supports like the city name, the city code, and geolocation. So this could get pretty busy, right? We could have like a lot of parameters here. Okay, so so we can improve on our code a little bit, right? So one way to do that would be to rearrange how our weather object works, right? So it's fine the way that it is, and this is pretty minimal code, which is kind of nice. It's easy to understand. But we could expand this a little bit to use an object, right? And why don't we give that a try? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say class, and I'll say, let's call it, I don't know, should we call it open weather? Yeah, let's just call it open weather. There we go, right? So we got the open weather class. And if we use this thing, what we'll do is we'll say new open weather, like this, right? And we could set this up to where you initialize it with a zip code, right? Or maybe a units, right? So let's do that, right? So I'm gonna start with open weather here, and I'll give it a constructor. And whenever you initialize one of these things, you'll pass in your API key, okay? And optionally, you'll pass in the units, okay? And if you don't include the units, they'll be imperial. And once you've passed these things in, we'll assign them to this object. So I'll say this dot API key equals the API key that you passed in. And then I'll say this dot units equals units, right? And so that's similar to what we have here. It'll work a little differently. But the other thing is we'll need to have a method now. So we'll use a method to get the weather. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take this whole thing right here, cut it, and move it inside the curly brace here that defines the object. And then I'm going to remove the keyword function. Okay? So I'll make a method on the class that does the same thing we did before, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to simplify this method because these two properties, API key and units, now are properties of the class, right? So I'll remove these, and if you've initialized an instance of this with these two properties, then they belong to this thing, and we don't have to keep sending them, okay? So we've got these, and then now what I want to do is over here, I'll have to set API key and units, right? I'm going to leave those two things alone, and what I think I'll do here is I'll just deconstruct into API key and units, right? So I'll just deconstruct this because it has these two properties on it, and then that way I don't have to change this line. It won't make that get a lot longer, right? And then now when you call get weather, it will do all the same things it did before. But now our code is going to work a little bit differently, right, on the client side or the developer side. So let's go over to index.html. And in here, instead of calling get weather directly, what we'll do is we'll make a new instance of the get weather object. And we only need to make one of these. You could make a new one every time you call this, but I think it's better for us to just make one and kind of hold on to it. So I'm going to say, how about weather equals new open weather, and we're going to initialize that with a unit and an API key, so, or value, right? So I'll move these things like this, and I'll grab these two guys, and what I want to do is I want to initialize this thing with the API key and the units. So it'll be initialized with these two values, and now I have an object that is an instance of of this open weather class, and it has a get weather method, and internally it stores two properties, one for each of these values, right? And what we'll do down here is this get weather should still work the same, but we'll use weather.getWeather to get that method, because this method now belongs to the class, right? So, or it belongs to our instance of the class, okay? So there we go. So that kind of rearranged our code a little bit, you know, but at least now we won't have to pass all these units in. So, and the API key. So I'll get rid of that. And now whenever you call get weather, you just pass in the zip, and then it'll use this key and this units, right? And we can add a method to change either of these things or set them after the instance was made too. So let's, but you know, we can add that later. So let's give it a try here and type in 94010. Oh, 9.6, right? Scattered clouds. So that's looking pretty good. So anyway, so that's another way to think about how this API is going to work. Instead of using a, you know, just a single function, we can create a class that has methods and stores properties on it. So, you know, just rearranging our code in an object-oriented fashion maybe makes for, you know, for a good design choice in some cases, okay? So anyway, thanks for watching, and we'll continue this in the next video and maybe add a few more features.